My name is Rachel, and for as long as I can remember, I've lived in the shadows of my family's table. I learned to smile through birthdays where my sister got the spotlight, through Christmases where my gifts felt like afterthoughts. But nothing prepared me for the day my 10-year-old son picked up the phone, eager to hear his grandmother's voice. He said, "Hi, Grandma," his face glowing with hope. And then came the words that froze him in place. "You're not invited to Christmas because of your mom." I watched the light drain from his eyes, his small voice breaking as he asked me, "Mom, what did I do wrong?" That night, as he cried himself to sleep, I sat in the dark and swore that this was the last time anyone would make my child feel unwanted. I didn't know it then, but that vow would change everything. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. It was late December in Boulder, Colorado, and the air outside carried that sharp winter bite that seeps through the windows no matter how tightly you shut them. Inside our little apartment, the heater rattled as it tried to keep up, and I strung a few cheap strands of colored lights across the living room window. They blinked unevenly, casting patches of red and green across the worn carpet. The radio played soft Christmas carols in the background, and for a moment I tried to let myself believe this could feel like a real holiday. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully hanging paper ornaments we had cut out together earlier that afternoon onto our small artificial tree. He was 10, with messy brown hair that stuck up no matter how I tried to smooth it, and eyes that still carried more innocence than the world deserved. He looked up at me suddenly, holding a crooked star in his hand. "Mom," he asked, his voice carrying that hopeful lilt only kids have, "do you think Grandma will let me open a present at her house this year?" The question hit me harder than I wanted to admit. My hands froze mid-air, a string of tinsel dangling uselessly. I forced a smile, but my throat felt tight. "Why don't we just focus on our tree first, sweetheart?" I said gently. He frowned, tilting his head like he could read the truth I wasn't ready to say out loud. Before I could gather myself, my phone buzzed sharply on the coffee table, cutting through the carol on the radio. The caller ID lit up with a name I had seen all my life. Margaret Miller. My mother. I hesitated, staring at the screen until the ringing threatened to stop. Then I picked up. "Hi, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Her tone was clipped without a trace of warmth. "Put Caleb on the phone." Confused, I glanced at my son. He set down the paper star, scrambled up, and pressed the phone to his ear with a shy smile. "Hi, Grandma," he said brightly. The silence on the line lasted just a beat too long, and then her words came sharp and cold. "You're not invited to Christmas because of your mom." For a second, the room froze. I watched Caleb's face change. His smile faltered. His cheeks flushed red and his eyes widened as if the words themselves had slapped him. He bit his lip, gripping the phone with both hands like maybe he had misheard. "Grandma," he whispered, but the line had already gone dead. He lowered the phone slowly and looked at me. Confusion etched across his young face. "Mom, what did I do wrong? Did I do something bad?" I knelt down in front of him, my heart twisting into knots. I brushed his hair back with trembling fingers, forcing steadiness into my voice. "You didn't do anything wrong, Caleb. Not one thing. This isn't about you, none." He blinked at me, fighting tears, and I saw the question he was too young to put into words. "If it's not me, then why does it hurt so much?" I pulled the phone from his hands before he could hear another cruel word, my thumb moving quickly as I typed a single reply. "Okay." Just 4 letters, but they felt like a wall slamming shut. I set the phone down on the table with deliberate calm, though my chest was burning. Caleb leaned into me, still searching my face for answers. I held him tight, breathing in the scent of paper and glue still clinging to his sweater from the ornaments. "Mom," he said quietly into my shoulder. "Are we not family?" The words nearly broke me, but I pressed my lips to his hair and whispered, "We are. You and me. We're more than enough." He nodded, though I could tell he didn't fully understand. His small hands clutched at my sweater, needing reassurance I wasn't sure how to give. Across the room, the lights on the tree blinked unsteadily, one bulb flickering on and off, stubborn against the dark. I stared at it, my mind racing, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. All my life I had been pushed aside, made to feel like the shadow of someone else's child. But this was different. They hadn't just cast me out. They had aimed their cruelty at my son. Something shifted inside me, then sharp and unshakable. I stroked Caleb's back, rocking him gently as if he were still the baby I had once promised to protect. My eyes lifted, and in the reflection of the darkened window, I caught my own gaze. The woman staring back no longer looked like a girl begging for approval. In that glass, I saw someone whose resolve had hardened with every slight, every dismissal, every cold word. This was the last time they would ever have the power to humiliate us. Caleb sighed against me, finally relaxing his eyelids heavy. I tucked a blanket around him and watched as he drifted toward sleep beside the little tree. The phone buzzed again on the table, the screen lighting with another call from my mother. I didn't move to answer. I simply reached out, flipped it face down, and let the silence settle. In the quiet, with the faint carol still humming from the radio and the glow of the blinking lights, I made myself a promise. Whatever came next, my son would never again feel unwanted. This would be the last Christmas we spent begging for a seat at someone else's table. And for the first time in years, a spark of determination burned brighter than the sting of rejection. The memory came back to me as sharply as if I had just stepped through the front door of that old house in St. Louis. It was Christmas morning, the kind of morning kids waited for all year, with the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting from the kitchen and the sound of carols playing from the stereo in the living room. Our tree stood tall, twinkling with glass ornaments that had been in the family for years. Everyone crowded around it, the air buzzing with excitement. Chloe sat right in the center, her blonde curls tied with a red ribbon, cheeks flushed with anticipation. She was only 12 that year, but even then she seemed to shine brighter in my parents' eyes than anyone else in the room. Dad held the camera poised, finger ready on the shutter, Mom kneeling beside Chloe with a smile that stretched wide. When the shiny pink bicycle was wheeled out from behind the couch, Chloe squealed so loudly the neighbors probably heard. For me, she shouted, leaping up, throwing her arms around Mom. Dad snapped picture after picture, his voice warm with pride. Smile, sweetheart. Show us that big smile. The flash lit the room again and again as if no moment could be missed. I waited quietly on the edge of the couch, my heart racing for my turn. A small package was finally placed in my lap, wrapped in plain paper with a crooked bow. I peeled it open carefully, hoping there was some surprise hidden inside. My fingers closed around a gray wool scarf, hand-knitted, the yarn rough against my skin. Mom patted my shoulder. It gets cold in the winter. I thought this would help keep you warm. I forced a smile, murmured, "Thank you," though my voice cracked. Around me, the laughter and clicking of the camera continued, none of it pointed in my direction. Chloe was already riding her new bike in the hallway, Dad crouching to capture the blur of pink as if she were a star on stage. Inside, I felt invisible. The scarf might as well have been a reminder you don't belong at the center. As the years rolled on, the pattern never changed. Holiday dinners meant a long, polished dining table in the front room. The main seats were always reserved. Dad at the head, Mom beside him, Chloe right in the middle next to whichever relatives mattered most that year. I was guided to the side table, squeezed in with the younger cousins, listening to their chatter about toys, while my eyes kept drifting to the main table where Chloe laughed and shone under the questions and praise. I tried to act like it didn't matter. I laughed at jokes too young for me, played along with their silly games, all while a quiet ache grew heavier inside my chest. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in the dining room mirror, a teenage girl smiling politely, clapping for Chloe's piano recital at the family gathering. But her eyes told a different story. One year, I had won a science fair ribbon at school for a solar project. I came home brimming with pride, certain this would be my moment. I laid the certificate on the table as Mom stirred a pot of cider. She glanced at it for a second, then smiled vaguely. "That's nice, dear. Did you hear Chloe played the entire piece without missing a note today? Everyone was so impressed." The words felt like a door shutting in my face. I nodded, folded the certificate, and tucked it into my backpack where it stayed unseen. The memory of those years clings even now like the scent of pine needles that never quite leaves a winter coat. No matter how hard I tried, it was as if the light in that house never reached me. And then just last year the cycle repeated itself, not with me but with Caleb. We had gone to my parents' house, still clinging to a shred of hope that things might be different for him. He sat on the floor with the other kids, waiting his turn, eyes bright and eager. Chloe's children tore open box after box, new video games, fancy dolls, a shiny set of drums. The room echoed with laughter and applause. Finally, someone passed Caleb a thin package. He tore at the paper cheeks, glowing, only to find a pair of plain socks folded neatly inside. He looked up at me, trying so hard to smile as if not showing disappointment would make it easier for me. I smiled back, but something inside me twisted in agony. It was the same gray scarf all over again, the same message whispered between the lines, "You're not worth the shine." That night after we left, Caleb asked quietly in the car, "Mom, do they like me?" His small voice cracked, and the headlights caught the glisten of tears he tried to hide. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, every muscle in my jaw clenched. In that moment, I understood more clearly than ever the pain I had carried all my life had passed on to him, and I couldn't allow that to happen again. I would not let my son grow up believing he was invisible. The thought pressed hard in my chest, now sitting in our little apartment, watching him sleep under the glow of our blinking lights. The memories of Chloe's bicycle, my scarf, the side table, the forgotten certificate. All of it crashed against the image of Caleb holding socks with a trembling smile. History had repeated itself, but it would not do so forever. Not if I had any say in it. I tucked the blanket around him and whispered softly, more to myself than to him. Never again. The bathroom tiles were cold beneath my knees as I clutched the thin plastic stick, staring at the 2 pink lines that had appeared. My breath caught in my throat, and the noise of students laughing and music down the hall felt like it belonged to another world entirely. I was 22, a junior at the University of Missouri, and in 1 second, everything I thought I knew about my future shattered. I stayed there shaking until I heard the knock on the door. "Rach, you okay in there?" It was Daniel, a friend from my dorm. His voice muffled by the door. I swallowed hard, shoved the test deep into my backpack, and forced a reply. "Yeah, just give me a minute." But when I finally walked back into the hallway, the weight of it pressed down so heavy I could barely breathe. I told Jason that night, sitting in his old beat-up Honda parked under the flickering streetlight by the student center. His hands were tight around the steering wheel, his jaw set. I held my breath, waiting for him to say we'd figure it out together. Instead, he let out a long sigh and shook his head. "I'm not ready for this," he said, eyes fixed straight ahead. "I can't do this, Rachel. Figure it out yourself." The words hit like a slap. Before I could even respond, he pulled out of the lot, and by the next day his phone was disconnected. He vanished, and just like that, the boy I thought I loved became nothing but an empty seat in class and a void in my phone contacts. I tried to tell myself I still had my parents, that even if Jason was gone, Mom and Dad wouldn't let me drown. I drove back to St. Louis, clutching the steering wheel, rehearsing what I would say. When I stood in the kitchen, Margaret barely looked up from her recipe cards. Dad sat at the table reading the newspaper. I told them in a rush, my hands trembling, "I'm pregnant. I don't know what to do, but I need your help." For a moment there was only silence. Then Mom's lips thinned, her brow furrowing. "Rachel," she said, voice sharp, "how could you be so careless? Do you realize what this will do to Chloe's wedding?" I blinked. "What does her wedding have to do with this? I'm your daughter. I need you." Dad lowered the paper, his expression stony. "Get rid of it. You're not ready. You'll ruin everything. Chloe deserves her moment. She's getting married this summer. We cannot have you parading around with a belly stealing her spotlight." The room spun. "You want me to end this pregnancy because of Chloe's wedding?" My voice cracked. "Because it's the right thing," Dad said flatly. "You can't handle this. And we won't handle it for you." I searched their faces for a flicker of softness, a shred of the love I had always longed for. There was nothing. Mom turned back to her recipe cards. Dad lifted the paper again. My hands shook as I went upstairs, pulled my old duffel from the closet, and stuffed in clothes. I waited for footsteps on the stairs for someone to come after me, but the house was silent. I carried the bag to my car, my keys rattling in my hand. On the porch, Chloe appeared, still in her silk robe, her engagement ring catching the light. She leaned against the railing, watching me. "What's going on?" I hesitated, searching her face for compassion. "I'm pregnant," I whispered. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "Seriously, Rachel, you always do this. You always find a way to make everything about you." She shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips as if it was all some joke. "Don't ruin this for me." I couldn't speak. I shouldered my bag, walked past her without another word, and slid into the driver's seat of my old Toyota. My fingers tightened on the wheel as I pulled away from the house I had grown up in, leaving behind the porch light, glowing faintly against the dark. Hours later, I unlocked the door of a tiny apartment on the south side of town, one I had found through a flyer pinned on a bulletin board. The carpet was stained. The heater groaned and the bathroom smelled of mildew, but it was mine. I dropped my duffel on the floor, sank down onto the thin mattress, and pressed a hand against my stomach. "Don't worry," I whispered to the silence. "You'll never be alone, not like me." Tears slipped down my cheeks, hot and steady, but beneath them a quiet determination began to grow. If my parents and Jason had all walked away, then I would do this myself. My child would never feel invisible, never sit at the side table, never wonder if they mattered. Outside, the city lights flickered through the blinds, casting long shadows on the wall. I closed my eyes, curled around the life just beginning inside me, and made a promise that no one would ever take away. The mornings always started before sunrise, when the streets of St. Louis were still quiet, and the sky was that pale gray color that promised another long day. I slipped into the cafe on the corner of Grand Avenue, tied on the apron that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and sugar, and started pulling espresso shots before most people even thought about waking up. The bell over the door jingled as the early crowd shuffled in. Construction workers, nurses coming off night shifts, students with messy hair clutching textbooks. I pasted on a smile, poured lattes, wiped down counters, and tried not to think about how heavy my eyelids felt. By mid-afternoon, I left the cafe with my shoes sticky from spilled syrup, walked 3 blocks to pick up Caleb from the sitter, and carried him home against my hip. He was still so small then, barely 2 years old, with soft curls and eyes that followed me everywhere. I fed him peanut butter sandwiches, set him down with a stack of board books, and kissed the top of his head before leaving again for the night shift. The office building downtown gleamed with glass and steel, but I only ever saw it empty, lights off except for the fluorescent glow of cleaning crews. I pushed a mop bucket down endless hallways, the wheels squeaking against polished tile. Some nights I scrubbed bathrooms until my knuckles cracked from the bleach. The paycheck barely covered rent, but I told myself it was just temporary, just enough to keep us afloat. Weekends didn't feel like weekends. I stood behind a register at the supermarket on the south side, scanning groceries under the hum of fluorescent lights, repeating the same greeting 100 times a day. "Did you find everything you needed?" My feet ached so badly at night I sometimes couldn't untie my own shoes. Still, when Caleb was tucked into bed, I opened my old laptop, its fan wheezing like it might die any second. The screen flickered, but it worked well enough for me to teach myself code. My fingers stumbled across the keyboard at first, clumsy and uncertain. I watched tutorials until my eyes blurred, copied snippets of code line by line, and practiced until the logic began to click. There were nights when exhaustion hit so hard I collapsed on the bathroom floor, the cool tile pressing against my cheek. Once I actually blacked out, waking with a start and realizing Caleb was stirring in the other room crying for his bottle. My legs shook as I pulled myself up, filled the bottle with formula, and rocked him back to sleep. His small hand rested against my chest, his breathing even, and in that moment I knew there was no choice but to keep going. Money was always tight. I stretched every dollar until it screamed. We ate noodles more often than anything else, and when I had just enough left for a carton of eggs or some fruit, I saved them for Caleb. Watching him bite into an apple while I ate plain pasta made the hunger worth it. One night as I typed away at the kitchen table, the glow of the laptop casting shadows across the peeling wallpaper, Caleb waddled over in his footy pajamas. His words were new, shaky, but clear enough, mommy strong. He grinned, proud of himself, his tiny voice carrying more weight than he could possibly understand. The dam broke inside me. I pulled him onto my lap, burying my face in his hair, and sobbed. Not the quiet tears I had trained myself to hide, but the kind that racked through my chest. Because if my 2-year-old could see me as strong, then maybe, just maybe, I really was. Weeks blurred into months, and then one evening, an email popped up from a small clinic in Kansas City. They had seen some code I'd posted in a forum and wanted help building a scheduling tool. The job was small, barely more than a favor, but they offered $500. $500. My hands shook as I typed back, yes, absolutely. I poured every bit of myself into that project coding late at night while Caleb slept beside me on the couch, the hum of the heater masking the sound of my keystrokes. When I sent it off and they transferred the payment, I stared at my bank account until the numbers blurred. For the first time in years, I could breathe. The next morning, I walked into the shoe store with Caleb's little hand in mine. His sneakers had holes in the soles, his socks peeking through, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. He tried on a pair of bright blue sneakers, bouncing on his toes as if he could fly. "Do they feel good?" I asked, crouching to tie the laces. He nodded furiously. "Fast," he said, grinning wide. At the register, I swiped my card without fear for once. Walking out of the store, watching Caleb race down the sidewalk in his new shoes, his laughter echoing in the winter air, I felt something crack open inside me. It wasn't just about the shoes. It was proof that my work, those endless nights, the exhaustion, the sacrifices, was starting to mean something. For a fleeting moment, joy flooded through me, bright and fierce, a reminder that even in the hardest years, small victories mattered. And as I watched my son run ahead, his blue sneakers flashing against the gray concrete, I let myself believe that maybe the future held more than survival. By 2014, Caleb was almost 4, and the nights of rocking him to sleep while coding on my old laptop had built into something I couldn't ignore anymore. I wanted more than survival. I wanted to prove that the long hours and sacrifice meant something. That spring, I scraped together every dollar I had cashed out, what little was left of my savings, and registered a company under a name that came to me during one of those sleepless nights, Meditrack Solutions. It sounded ambitious for what it really was. Just me at the kitchen table, a secondhand laptop humming, and a toddler coloring beside me. But it felt like a declaration. I wasn't just a single mom juggling odd jobs. I was a founder, even if the world didn't believe it yet. Those first years were brutal. I pitched clinics around Missouri trying to convince them that tracking medicine digitally could save them time and money. Most looked at me like I was crazy. "We've been using paper charts for decades," one administrator said, shaking his head. "Why would we need this?" So I kept building. Nights blurred into mornings, coffee replaced sleep, and my fingers cramped from hours of typing. I taught myself sales, marketing, and accounting because I couldn't afford anyone else. Caleb would toddle into the room in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes, and I'd scoop him onto my lap while debugging code. His little voice kept me company, humming songs from preschool while I tried to make sense of numbers on the screen. By 2016, I'd run through everything I had. The small grants and favors I'd pieced together dried up. A client backed out last minute, leaving me with bills I couldn't cover. I had to shut the office I'd just rented, sell the desks I'd proudly ordered secondhand. I cried in the parking lot the day I handed over the keys. But failure wasn't new to me. I started again, rebuilt from scratch. But this time I was determined to find someone who believed in the vision. That's when Mark Evans appeared. He was slick, always in a tailored jacket, hair gelled back, talking about opportunity and scaling fast. We met at a tech networking event in Kansas City, and he seemed impressed with MediTrack. "You've got grit," he told me, clapping me on the back. That's what investors like me look for. For months, he dangled promises of funding. He invited me to lunches, introduced me to people who nodded and smiled but never actually wrote checks. When he finally offered a contract, I was too desperate to notice the traps buried in the fine print. I signed believing this was the break I had been waiting for. Within weeks, the money vanished. Mark withdrew everything under the guise of operational costs, and when I confronted him, his tone turned cold. "You didn't meet deliverables. That's on you." Then the lawsuit came. A thick envelope slid under my apartment door, accusing me of breaching the very contract I had trusted. The fear was suffocating. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, imagining everything being taken away. Caleb was 6, then old enough to notice my hollow eyes and the way my hands shook when I poured him cereal. The day of the hearing, I sat outside the courthouse on a stone bench, clutching the papers until my knuckles went white. My cheap suit itched against my skin, and every sound, the slam of a car door, the shuffle of footsteps, made my chest tighten. That's when I met Allison Brooks. She wasn't polished like the lawyers Mark had brought. She carried a stack of files in her arms and wore practical shoes that clicked evenly against the marble floor. She had been recommended through a friend of a friend, and I had barely been able to pay her retainer. She sat beside me, flipping through the documents. "He thinks you'll fold," she said simply. "Don't." Inside the courtroom, my voice trembled as I tried to answer questions. Mark sat across from me, smirking, his lawyer objecting at every turn. My stomach churned, but Allison's calm presence beside me kept me from crumbling. When it was her turn, she stood with quiet confidence. She pointed out the hidden clauses, the vague wording, the missing invoices that proved Mark had fabricated costs. Her tone was sharp, controlled, cutting through his lawyer's bluster. I remember gripping the edge of the table, watching as Mark's smug expression slipped. For the first time, I felt the balance shift. Hours later, the judge ruled in my favor. The case was dismissed. Mark's funding scheme was exposed, and his threats deflated in an instant. Outside, I stood on the courthouse steps, the cold air stinging my face, my knees nearly buckling with relief. Caleb ran up to me, his backpack bouncing, and wrapped his arms around my waist. "You did it, Mom," he said. His voice muffled against my coat. I sank to my knees, holding him tight, inhaling the scent of crayons and peanut butter lingering on his clothes. For once, the victory wasn't just surviving, it was winning. Allison closed her briefcase, looking down at me with a small smile. "Don't quit," she said firmly. "If you can stand through this, there isn't much that can knock you down again." Her words lodged deep in my chest. I watched her walk away, the echo of her shoes fading, and for the first time since starting this journey, I believed she might be right. By the spring of 2020, the news was impossible to escape. Every channel carried images of overcrowded hospitals, doctors in masks with tired eyes, stretchers lining hallways. Colorado was no exception. Boulder Community Hospital. The clinics I'd once begged to take me seriously were suddenly calling non-stop. They didn't care about my lack of polish or the size of my company anymore. They needed help, and they needed it yesterday. MediTrack had limped along for years, just enough to survive after the lawsuit with Mark, but overnight it became essential. The system I'd built to track medication shipments and oxygen supply chains, once brushed off as unnecessary, was now the difference between hospitals running out of life-saving supplies or making it through the night. I had a team of 8 then young developers who had believed in me when few others did. We rented a small office above a shuttered bookstore on Pearl Street, but once the pandemic hit, we moved into my living room. Cords snaked across the carpet, laptops lined the dining table, and empty coffee cups stacked by the sink. For months, we lived off takeout and adrenaline, working 20-hour days. The phone rang constantly. A nurse in Denver needed an emergency oxygen delivery rerouted. A clinic in Colorado Springs begged us to track shipments of ventilator parts. The system crashed under the weight of so many new users, and we scrambled at 3 a.m. to patch servers and spin up backups. Every beep of my inbox felt like another life depending on us. Meanwhile, Caleb sat beside me at the kitchen table, his Chromebook open for remote school. At first, he tried diligently logging into Zoom classes, raising his hand, but more often than not, he nodded off, cheek pressed to the keyboard, while I typed frantically inches away. Sometimes I'd glance over, see the faint outline of keys imprinted on his skin, and guilt would spear through me. One night in May, I was answering a client call when I noticed him asleep in the corner of the couch, math worksheet sliding to the floor. His small body curled under a blanket, the soft sound of his breathing steady. The sight nearly broke me. I muted the call for a moment, covered my face with my hands, and whispered, "I'm sorry, baby. Just hold on." Then I unmuted and kept talking because I had no choice. The exhaustion was bone deep. My team rotated naps on the couch. I once woke up with the imprint of a keyboard on my forehead after collapsing at the desk, but none of us quit. Not when the stakes were this high. Then came the email. It was a simple subject line. "Thank you." Inside, a doctor from a small hospital in Pueblo wrote, "If it weren't for your system tonight, we wouldn't have had the blood supply needed for surgery. A young man is alive because of you." I read it 3 times, the words swimming as tears blurred the screen. Caleb, half asleep, rubbed his eyes and looked at me. "What's wrong, Mom?" "Nothing's wrong," I said, pulling him close. "Someone just lived because of what we did." He smiled drowsily and laid his head on my shoulder, and in that moment the endless fatigue felt almost worth it. The months blurred together. The world outside felt apocalyptic. Empty streets, sirens wailing, masks covering every face. But inside our cramped apartment, it was a war room. I lived on coffee and granola bars, hands cramping from typing. Caleb grew quieter, older than his years, sitting patiently as I raced against time. By December, MediTrack wasn't just a scrappy startup anymore. It was in use across dozens of hospitals, mentioned in state reports, whispered about in healthcare forums. The revenue covered payroll servers and then some, but I barely noticed. All I cared about was keeping the system alive another day. On one of those freezing nights, snow falling heavy outside the window, I sat at the laptop coding furiously. Caleb had climbed onto my lap with his blanket curling against me while I typed with one hand. His hair tickled my chin, his body warm against mine, and the blue glow of the screen reflected in both our eyes. The world was falling apart, but right there in that small circle of light, I felt something I hadn't in years, a steady flame of determination. I wasn't just keeping a company alive. I was proving to myself and to the family who had cast me aside that I was capable of more than they'd ever believed. And as I held Caleb close, one hand still moving over the keys, I knew I would keep going until this fire carried us somewhere they could never touch. By the summer of 2022, my body felt worn from 2 straight years of running on coffee and adrenaline, but MediTrack was no longer a desperate experiment. It was a lifeline used across Colorado and beyond. That was when the email arrived from Horizon Healthcare, one of the biggest medical networks in the country. They wanted to talk acquisition. At first, I ignored it. Selling felt like betrayal, like giving up the very thing that had defined my survival. But when Allison sat across from me at the kitchen table, contract spread between us, she spoke with the same steady voice she'd used years earlier outside the courthouse. "Rachel, this isn't giving up. This is moving forward. You've carried this alone long enough. We spent weeks negotiating." The calls dragged into the night, lawyers on both sides circling every clause, but when the final number was spoken, $12 million. I felt the air rush from my lungs. $12 million. Enough to pay off every debt, secure Caleb's future, and finally breathe without fear of eviction notices or overdue bills. Signing my name to that contract was surreal. My hands trembled as the pen glided across the paper. I thought about the gray scarf, the side tables, the socks they gave Caleb, and for once I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like someone who had built something real, something undeniable. I bought the mansion that fall. It sat just outside Boulder, a timber and glass structure overlooking Flatiron Lake, framed by pines that whispered in the wind. The first time we drove up the winding road, Caleb's face pressed against the car window, his eyes wide. When we stepped inside, the scent of cedar filled the air. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, spilling across polished stone floors. In the dining room, a walnut table stretched long enough to seat 20, and my fingertips traced its smooth grain. I thought of every Christmas I'd spent at the side table and whispered silently, "Not anymore." Caleb tore down the wide hallway, his laughter echoing against the high beams. "This is our castle, Mom," he shouted, his voice bouncing back like an anthem. I chased after him, laughing for the first time in what felt like years. That night after the movers left, we sat cross-legged on the floor of the empty living room, eating pizza straight from the box. Boxes were stacked against the walls, the chandelier above still swaying slightly from being hung. Caleb leaned against me, grease on his fingers, his eyes sparkling. "Do you think Grandma will come see it?" he asked quietly. My chest tightened. I wanted to tell him no, not after everything. Instead, I kissed the top of his head. Maybe. But even if she doesn't, this is ours. Word traveled quickly. Boulder wasn't a big place, and soon whispers trickled through the neighborhood. I heard them in the grocery store, felt them in the curious stares from across the street. A woman with perfect hair leaned toward her friend by the produce aisle, not realizing I was in earshot. A single mom bought that place, must have married rich. I turned the corner, locking eyes with her, and offered a smile that was all teeth. No husband, just hard work. The way her expression faltered was almost sweeter than the victory itself. At night, after Caleb fell asleep in his new oak bed with shelves full of books, I wandered through the quiet mansion. My footsteps echoed, reminding me how empty it once felt inside my parents' house, even when it was full of people. Now the silence was different. Peaceful, not lonely. I stood before the massive glass wall in the living room, watching moonlight spill across the lake. The water shimmered black and silver, and in my reflection I didn't see the timid girl clutching a scarf anymore. I saw a woman who had endured, who had fought, who had clawed her way to this moment. The tension of the whispers, the stares, the questions, they didn't matter. Let them wonder how I had done it. Let them doubt. I no longer needed their approval, and certainly not their permission. I pressed my palm against the glass, the cold seeping into my skin, and whispered to myself, "From now on, no one pushes us aside. Not ever again." Behind me, the steady sound of Caleb's breathing drifted from down the hall. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The lake outside stretched wide and endless like a promise, and I knew we were no longer fighting for scraps. We had a seat of our own, and it was here in this home, in this life I had carved from nothing. The call came 2 weeks before Christmas, just as the first heavy snow had settled over Boulder. I answered out of habit, not expectation. Margaret's voice cut through the static, sharp as glass. "Don't bother showing up this year. And Caleb, he's not invited either. Because of you." I froze the phone pressed tight to my ear. Caleb was in the next room humming to himself as he built a Lego tower on the rug. I stepped into the hallway, my hand trembling, but it was too late. His ears were sharper than I realized. "Mom." His small voice reached me. "Grandma said I can't go. I couldn't speak." The old ache, the humiliation I had carried for years, now aimed directly at him. I ended the call, my pulse thundering. Caleb's eyes searched mine wide and uncertain. "Why don't they want us?" he whispered. I pulled him into my arms, my chin resting on his messy hair. "It's not about you, sweetheart. It's never been about you." But inside something snapped. If my parents wanted to shut doors, I would open mine wider. That night after I tucked Caleb into bed, I sat at the long walnut table in the dining room of the mansion. The surface gleamed under the chandelier, big enough to seat 20, big enough to erase every side table memory burned into me. My laptop glowed, cursor blinking. I opened my contacts, hovering over names that had also faded from the main family gatherings. First, Aunt Linda. She had always been the one to sneak me cookies when Mom scolded me as a kid. I dialed her number. Her voice cracked when she answered. Rachel. Aunt Linda. I said, my throat tight. Did you get an invitation this year? A bitter laugh. No, honey. They said it would be simpler with just Chloe's family. Simpler, like the rest of us are clutter. The pain in her voice told me everything. What about Daniel? I asked. He didn't get one either, she said. He tried to laugh it off, but I can tell it hurts. I thanked her, promised I'd call back. My fingers trembled as I dialed Daniel's number. He answered quickly. Cousin, he said, voice half joking, half broken. Guess we're not part of the main show this year. I swallowed. Daniel, I don't want you sitting at home feeling like that. I've got space, real space. I want you here. There was silence on the line, then a sharp inhale. Are you serious? At your place? Yes, I said firmly. At my place. The last call was the hardest. Grandma Ruth. When her voice came through thin but warm, I almost lost my composure. Grandma? I asked gently. Did you hear from them about Christmas? A pause, then a sigh. No, Rachel. Your mother said she wanted a small gathering. Just Chloe's little family. I suppose there's no seat for me anymore. Tears stung my eyes. There's always a seat for you here, I whispered. After the calls, I sat staring at the dark lake through the glass walls. Snowflakes tapped against the window, drifting down in slow silence. The loneliness that had followed me for years felt different now. Less like emptiness, more like space waiting to be filled. I opened a group chat, my fingers steady for the first time that night. I typed the words as if they had been waiting inside me all along. If you have no place to go, come to me. For a moment the screen was still, then Daniel's name popped up first. We'll be there. Just tell me when. Seconds later, Aunt Linda, I'm packing already. Then Grandma Ruth, simple and short, but enough to crack something open inside me. Send the address. I pressed the phone to my chest, my heart pounding with something I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. The next morning, I called a local decorator, a woman named Harper, who ran a small design company in town. I want the house to look like Christmas exploded, I told her. Lights, garlands, a tree that touches the ceiling. Everything. She hesitated. That's a tight timeline. Are you sure? Yes, I said without blinking. I want everyone who walks in to feel like they finally came home. We set the date, and after I hung up, Caleb came bounding into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Who were you talking to? I crouched down, brushing his hair back. I was making plans, I told him. We're going to have our own Christmas this year, one nobody can take away. His smile spread slowly, and for the first time since that awful phone call, his shoulders relaxed. He whispered, almost as if afraid it might not be true. With everyone. With everyone. I promised. That night, as the mansion lay quiet and the snow thickened outside, I walked through each room with a notebook scribbling ideas. Candles in the windows, stockings along the stone fireplace, a menu that smelled like warmth and love. The house had always been beautiful, but now it would become more than wood and glass. It would become proof that no one, not even my own parents, had the power to erase us. I stopped at the head of the long table again, running my hands over the polished surface. I imagined it filled, laughter echoing, no one shoved to the side. I thought of Caleb's face when he saw everyone gathered, the way his eyes would light up, the way he would finally feel chosen. And I knew then with a clarity that burned steady inside me, this was the year I stopped waiting for a seat. This was the year I built the table myself. The trucks started arriving the week before Christmas headlights, cutting through the white haze of snow that seemed to fall every night that December. A team of decorators in thick jackets and wool hats spilled out their boots, crunching on the driveway as they unloaded boxes of garlands, strings of lights and ornaments big enough to fill both of my arms. Inside the mansion, ladders scraped against the tall beams as they strung golden lights around the windows. Outside, the porch railing gleamed with twinkling bulbs that cast a warm glow against the icy night. At the center of the living room, they raised a 14-foot pine tree, fresh from a farm in the Rockies, its branches spreading wide enough to nearly brush the chandelier. Caleb stood at the bottom, his mouth open as the star was lifted into place. "It's taller than me 100 times," he shouted, spinning in circles. The fireplace in the great room roared flames crackling against the stone. Stockings with each guest's name, hand-stitched by a woman in town I had commissioned, hung in a neat row. For the first time, I saw the mansion transform from a house into something that breathed joy. I met with Harper, a local chef, known for blending Colorado flavors into traditional dishes. She spread her menu across the walnut table, pointing out sketches of roasted turkey with applewood smoke, fresh salmon grilled with herbs from a nearby farm, and winter salads dressed with candied pecans and blood oranges. For dessert, she promised warm apple pies dusted with cinnamon sugar, the crust flaky enough to melt at the touch of a fork. "It needs to feel like home," I told her. "Not fancy, not stiff. I want them to feel seen." She smiled, scribbling notes. That's the kind of meal people remember. When the team left each night, I sat in the glow of the Christmas tree scissors, and paper scattered around me as I wrapped gifts myself. For Aunt Linda, a photo book of Colorado landscapes so she could carry the Rockies with her wherever she went. For Daniel's little boy, a Lego spaceship set he had begged for but his parents couldn't afford. For Grandma Ruth, a sea blue wool scarf soft enough to guard her against the cold she so often complained about. Each one I wrapped in brown paper tied with twine and tucked a sprig of pine beneath the knot. Caleb sat beside me carefully, sticking tape to the corners, his face flushed with concentration. "Mom," he said suddenly, his eyes bright, "this feels like our Christmas, not theirs, ours." I froze, the words sinking deep. He was right. For the first time, Christmas wasn't something we were waiting to be invited into. It was something we were building ourselves. I pulled him close, pressing my forehead to his. "Yes," I whispered, "ours." But just when it all felt like it was falling into place, the storm hit. Snow hammered against the windows, wind howling across Flatiron Lake like a warning. Roads shut down, trucks were stranded, and Harper called with worry in her voice. "The deliveries are stuck in Denver. If they don't clear by tomorrow, I won't have half of what we need." Panic surged in my chest. I imagined everyone arriving, hungry children, Grandma Ruth shivering in her scarf, the table set but empty. My mind raced back to every holiday I had spent at the side table, forgotten, embarrassed. I couldn't let this Christmas turn hollow, too. I paced the kitchen, checking weather alerts, calling suppliers, begging for updates. Caleb watched me, his Lego spaceship half built on the counter. "Mom," he said gently, "it'll be okay." I tried to smile, but my throat felt tight. I just want it to be perfect for everyone. That night I barely slept, listening to the wind pound against the walls. At dawn, I stepped onto the porch, snow piled high, the driveway buried. My phone buzzed. A message from Harper Truck made it through. "We'll be there in 2 hours." I closed my eyes, a sob of relief escaping before I could stop it. By the time the sun set that evening, the kitchen smelled of roasting turkey and fresh herbs. Delivery boxes piled by the back door, the last-minute supplies arriving just in time. I leaned against the counter, exhaustion in my bones but a smile breaking through. Later I stepped outside again. Snow blanketed the yard in glittering white, the golden lights reflecting off the frozen lake like stars scattered across its surface. The mansion glowed behind me, every window a beacon against the dark. I wrapped my coat tighter, my breath curling in the air, and let the scene sink in. This house, once silent, was now ready for laughter, for warmth, for a family of my own choosing. And for the first time in a very long time, my chest didn't ache with what was missing. It swelled with what was about to arrive. The first headlights appeared at the bottom of the drive, just as twilight settled over Flatiron Lake. The snow had quieted, leaving the world hushed and glowing under strings of golden lights draped along the porch. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, my heart pounding as the SUV climbed the slope, its tires crunching over fresh powder. Daniel stepped out first. His puffer jacket zipped to his chin, his breath fogging in the air. He froze when he saw the house illuminated against the snowy backdrop. His eyes swept over the towering windows, the glittering tree visible through the glass, the wreaths swaying gently in the cold breeze. "Rachel," he whispered, shaking his head with disbelief. "You built a universe." I laughed softly, pulling him into a hug, his arms strong and familiar around me. "Welcome home," I said. The back doors opened, and his kids tumbled out squealing as they ran through the snow toward the porch. Their boots left messy trails, their laughter ringing sharp and bright. Another car pulled in behind, and Aunt Linda emerged balancing a pumpkin pie wrapped in foil. Her eyes filled with tears before she even made it to the steps. She pressed the warm dish into my hands and whispered, "My dear, I never thought I'd see something like this. You've given us Christmas back." Her words pierced straight into the softest part of me. I set the pie aside, wrapping my arms around her, both of us, holding on longer than necessary. Then came Grandma Ruth. Slowly, with Daniel supporting her arm, she climbed the steps. Her knit hat pulled low, her scarf tucked tight around her chin. When she reached me, she opened her arms, frail but steady. I stepped into her embrace, and she clung to me with surprising strength. Her cheek was damp against mine. "You've given Christmas back to us," she said through quiet sobs. I held her, my throat burning. "It's yours as much as mine," I managed. Inside the house filled quickly. Boots kicked off by the door coats piled on hooks, voices overlapping as everyone explored the rooms. The children shrieked when they saw the 14-foot tree, its ornaments glittering, the crystal star blazing at the top. Eli strummed his guitar near the fireplace, the melody of Silent Night weaving through the air. In the dining room, the walnut table stretched long and proud, set with porcelain plates and crystal glasses that caught the candlelight. I let everyone choose their own seats. No head of the table, no side table, no invisible corners. Aunt Linda sat beside Caleb, who beamed when she passed him mashed potatoes. Daniel's youngest climbed into Grandma Ruth's lap, tugging at her scarf, and she laughed with a sound I hadn't heard in years. The kitchen bustled as Harper's team served dish after dish, roasted turkey gleaming under golden skin, herb-grilled salmon, steaming fresh from the pan, winter salad, bright with citrus. The scent of cinnamon apple pies drifted in from the oven, mingling with the woody aroma of the fire. I carried a tray of mugs filled with warm cider weaving between chairs, catching glimpses of faces lit with joy. Laughter rose and fell, clinking glasses echoed under the beams, and for once the chatter wasn't small talk. It was real stories shared freely with no one competing for attention. Caleb leaned close to me, whispering, "Mom, it feels different here." His eyes scanned the room, the cousins he'd barely known now giggling with him over. Inside jokes, the adults leaning in to listen instead of turning away. "It's because everyone belongs," I whispered back, kissing his temple. Phones clicked and flashed. As Daniel snapped photos, Eli recorded a video of the kids dancing in the hall. Before long, the family group chat, which had been eerily silent for weeks, exploded with messages. Pictures of the feast, clips of Grandma swaying gently to Eli's guitar, a video of Caleb leading the other kids in a clumsy conga line. Someone posted a single line beneath a photo of the glowing mansion, "This is the real Christmas." I sat down in the middle of the long table, the chatter swirling around me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't on the edge watching. I was surrounded, anchored at the very heart. The faces that turned toward me weren't indifferent or dismissive. They were grateful, radiant, alive. I let the noise wash over me, the laughter mixing with the crackle of the fireplace, the soft strum of guitar strings. My chest swelled with something that had eluded me my whole life, something more powerful than pride or vindication: belonging. For the first time, I felt it settle into my bones, steady and unshakable, as if I had finally stepped into the place I was always meant to be. The morning after our Christmas feast, the mansion was quiet, except for the faint hiss of the fire that had burned all night. The smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey still lingered in the air. I padded downstairs in my slippers, stepping over blankets crumpled on the couch where kids had fallen asleep. The lake outside glistened under the pale winter sun, untouched snow sparkling like glass. For once, I thought I might have a calm morning. Then my phone buzzed. Once, twice, then, over and over until it seemed to vibrate with fury. I picked it up and stared at the screen, 30 missed calls, all from the same 3 names. Richard, Miller, Margaret. Miller, Chloe Harper. My stomach tightened, but I didn't feel the old panic. Caleb came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes, hair sticking up in every direction. "Who's calling Mom?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I set the phone on the table, hit speaker, and let the line open. The silence lasted barely a breath before my father's voice crashed through, deep and heavy. "You embarrassed us, Rachel. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The whole family saw those pictures. My mother's voice followed, sharp enough to cut. "You shamed this family, hosting some sideshow, inviting the scraps, turning it into gossip. Do you know what people are saying about us?" Chloe chimed in, her tone dripping with disdain. "You've always loved the spotlight, Rachel. Always the victim, always wanting attention. Well, congratulations. You've made us a laughingstock." I felt Caleb stiffen beside me. His small hand trembled as it reached for mine. I clasped it tightly, anchoring him. My voice came steady, stronger than I expected. For the first time, I said, my eyes locked on my sons. Everyone was seen. No one was excluded. Not one person left out in the cold. "Can you say the same for your table?" The line went silent. I thought maybe they had hung up, but then Grandma Ruth's voice rose, frail but fierce, cutting through like a bell. 30 years, she said, her words shaking with anger. 30 years of favoritism. Shame on you both. You praised Chloe while Rachel sat in the shadows. You gave her scraps and called it love. And now you dare accuse her when she finally opened a door for all of us. Shame. The room held its breath. On the other end there was nothing. No excuse, no denial. Just the faint sound of someone shifting the weight of truth, pressing down too hard for words. I stared at the phone, waiting, but the silence stretched. My father cleared his throat once, then said nothing. Margaret let out a sharp breath as if words had failed her. Chloe muttered something under her breath, but it faded into static. I reached forward, pressed the button, and ended the call. The sudden quiet filled the room, heavy but clean, like a storm had passed. Caleb looked up at me, his chin lifted. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by something new. Pride. He squeezed my hand, his small voice steady. "You told them, Mom. I knelt so we were eye level, brushing his hair back." "No, sweetheart. We showed them. You, me, everyone who sat at that table last night. That's what matters." The phone buzzed again, but I ignored it, pushing it aside as if it were nothing more than background noise. I took a deep breath, the kind that reached all the way down to my chest, and felt something loosen that had been bound tight for decades. For the first time, I wasn't carrying their shame. I was free. The fire crackled behind us, and through the glass wall the lake shimmered with new light. Caleb stood taller beside me, and in that reflection I no longer saw the girl clutching a gray scarf. I saw a mother steady and unafraid, and a son who would never have to wonder if he belonged. That afternoon, while the kids were still chasing each other through the halls, and the smell of pine lingered in every corner of the house, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't calls or accusations. It was the family group chat lighting up one notification after another. At the top, Daniel had changed the name from Miller Holiday to Boulder Family. My chest tightened as I read it, the words simple but carrying more weight than anyone could know. Photos streamed in. Linda's snapshot of the children lined up by the tree, Eli's short video of everyone clapping along to his guitar. Ruth's shaky but heartfelt selfie at the table with Caleb tucked against her side. Heart emojis, exclamation points, and laughter filled the thread. And then silence from the three names I half expected, half feared: Richard, Margaret, Chloe. No replies, no explanations, no acknowledgement. For the first time, their absence didn't sting. I looked at the flood of warmth on my screen and understood they had never really been present. And I didn't need them anymore. Days passed, and the house stayed alive with energy. Caleb ran through the snow with Daniel's kids, his cheeks flushed, his smile unguarded. Linda helped me in the kitchen, our hands brushing as we washed dishes side by side, her voice steady as she said, "You gave us something we'd forgotten we could have." Ruth lingered near the fireplace, wrapped in her new scarf, humming softly as if she were remembering an old hymn. On New Year's Eve, after the last guests left, the house finally grew still. The lake outside stretched silent and wide, its surface frozen into glass beneath the pale light of the moon. Caleb tugged at my sleeve, his coat zipped up to his chin, his boots crunching on the snow as he led me toward the edge of the dock. We stood together, the world hushed around us, flakes drifting gently through the cold air. The lights from the house reflected across the lake, golden streaks shimmering against silver ice. Caleb looked up at me, his breath puffing in small clouds. His eyes, so much older now than his 10 years, shone with certainty. "This is home, Mom." I pulled him close, wrapping my arms around his small frame, breathing in the scent of winter clinging to his hair. "Yes," I whispered, my voice steady, "this is our home." We stayed like that for a long moment, the silence broken only by the distant crack of ice shifting under the weight of the season. The ache I had carried for decades, the wound carved by favoritism and exclusion, finally eased. I realized I had stopped waiting for a seat at someone else's table. I had built my own. Later that night, as fireworks from town flared faintly against the horizon, I sat by the window watching the sparks fade into the cold air. My voice carried softly in my thoughts, words meant not just for me but for anyone who had ever felt unseen. If you've ever been left out, if you've ever been told you don't belong, remember this. You can build your own table. You can create a place where every voice matters, where no one is pushed aside, where your name is spoken with love. You are worthy of that space, and it can be yours. I glanced at Caleb curled under a blanket on the couch, his face calm in the glow of the fire. The scars of my past no longer felt like chains. They felt like proof that I had survived, and that survival had given me the strength to rewrite our story. So I'll leave you with this. Think about the moments you've been excluded, the times your worth was questioned. And then ask yourself, what would it look like to build your own table? Share it with me. Tell me about the traditions, the laughter, the people who make you feel seen. Because your story matters too. And maybe, just maybe, the family we create for ourselves is the one that lasts.